Hi, today we're going to talk about the significance of physical evidence. So, we already talked about what physical evidence was. We said that's any material that's relevant to a crime. And then we talked about the 5 different types of physical evidence: transfer, pattern, conditional, associative, etc., right? And we did examples of those, and you guys have had a lot of practice with that. Well, now we can take any of those types of evidence and we can put them into 2 categories: either individual evidence or class evidence, depending on what that evidence can do. And that gives the evidence significance in court, whether it's individual or class. So we're going to talk about that today. So the first type of category that you can put evidence into is what we call individual evidence. That's any material that can be identified to a specific individual or a single source. So individual evidence is any material that we can identify back to a person specifically or a source. And a lot of people get caught up on the fact that they think it always has to be a person, and it can definitely be an object as well. And I'll give you an example of that in just a second. So for example, a fingerprint is individual evidence. If you find a fingerprint at a crime scene, you can match it back to your suspect's left index finger, right? And you can say it only belongs to that one person's left index finger. No other prints will match that. That's individualizing it back to a specific individual. DNA is the same thing. You can match DNA back to a specific person. You can say, okay, here's their DNA profile. It matches this person's DNA profile 100%. It won't match anybody else on Earth, okay? That's an individual piece of evidence. The broken bottle is an example of matching something back to a single source. So for instance, say that you have a tiny piece of glass and then you have a broken bottle at your crime scene. If you can put the bottle back together and you can show where that broken piece fits into the bottle, you individualize that piece back to the bottle. That's also an individual piece of evidence, okay? Now, the key for individual evidence is that it always involves comparisons. You have to compare it back to something. For the glass piece, you had to compare it back to the broken bottle. It had to fit in. For the DNA, it had to match back to a specific person where you had a control sample. Same thing with the fingerprint. You have to have a 10 print card of somebody in order to match an unknown print to them. So in order to individualize evidence, you always have to have something to compare it back to in order for it to be considered individual. The second category of evidence is what we call class evidence. And class evidence is evidence that can only be associated with a group of items that share properties or characteristics that are the same. Probably the best example of this is blood type, right? Say I find a blood pool at my crime scene and it's type B blood, okay? And I pull my suspect over and they also have type B blood. Well, I can't arrest them and put them in prison just on that, right? Because how many other people in the world also have type B blood? A lot, okay? So class evidence is evidence that can put you with a group of items that share similar properties or characteristics. Hair is another great example. I can say that the hair is red. I can say it's long hair. I can say it's been dyed, right? But there's lots of people who have long hair that it's red that's dyed, right? So I can't say that it's just one person specifically, but in a group of people. Rope guns are the same way, like it's a 45 Glock. There's lots of 45 Glocks out there, right, that were made. Tire marks, shoe prints, all of those are examples of class evidence because it can be put into a group of characteristics but not individualized. So a lot of people think class evidence isn't useful, but it's actually extremely useful. Excuse me. The more class evidence you find, the greater the probative value. Let me give you an example of what I mean by that. Say that I'm at a crime scene and I have a blood pool that's type B blood. Okay, I find blue fibers on my victim that don't belong to the victim. I find a size 10 shoe print. Okay, a size 10 shoe print, and I find red hair. Okay, and my victim has blonde hair. So there's 4 things right there. By themselves, all class evidence, right? We already talked about that. But put them together, what are the chances of somebody other than my suspect having all 4 of those things in common? So if I pull my suspect over, the person who I think did it, and they have red hair, they have a size 10 shoe, I take their blood type, their type B blood, and they have a blue shirt that has a rip in it where the fibers could have come from. Okay, all that by them individually is considered class evidence by themselves, but you put all that together and the chances of somebody else in the world having all 4 of those characteristics and being able to be at my crime scene is not very good. So the more that I have, the more different types of class evidence I have that gets multiplied together, the greater the value in court, because the chances of that being in common is not very good. So let me also give you another example of how class evidence works. A student is seen leaving the student parking lot after having been near a car with a broken window. The car's CD player was missing. The student was identified as having light brown hair, wearing a white shirt, blue jeans, and dark-colored athletic shoes. So, in our school, which has 1,600 students at Goldwater, how common are these characteristics? So how can we use this to narrow down our suspect pool? So I'm going to give you an example of how this works. Okay, so I am going to say that we have a class of 17 students right now. Okay, there's 17 students in our class. I'm going to take a poll and I'm going to say, okay, how many of you guys are wearing a white shirt? And there were 4 people in our class at the time wearing a white shirt. So 4 divided by 17 is 23%. So 23% of the kids in our class were wearing a white shirt. I took that 23% and I multiplied it times 1,600, and that told me that there were 368 students on campus that day that could be wearing a white shirt. If we took our class as like a general population, right? If we said this was a sample of the student body at Goldwater, okay? But 368 students is still too many to figure out who solved. 368 students is still too many to figure out who committed the crime. So now I'm going to take a look at the next thing. So we said white shirt was one of the characteristics, right? That was our first one. The next one we're going to take a look at is jeans, okay? So I'm going to ask, of the 17 students in my class, how many of you guys would be wearing jeans today? 14 of you said yes. So 14 divided by 17 is 82%. 82% of you would be wearing jeans. Okay, so I do 0.82 times 1,600, and that's 1,000. Okay, 1,300 students that are wearing jeans. That's way too many to take a look at. But let's multiply these together, because we said we could multiply probabilities together. So 0.23 times 0.82 is 19%. So 19% of the students on campus would be wearing a white shirt and jeans. That's 304 students. So I'm getting a little bit better. Let's add in some of these other characteristics, okay? So the third characteristic that we said that the person had was light brown hair. There was only 9 people in our class that had light brown hair of the 17 students. That's 53%. So now let's add that to our white shirt and jeans. So 0.23 times 0.82 times 0.53, that's 10%. 10% of the students on campus would have all 3 of those in common. They would have a white shirt, they'd have jeans, and they'd have a light brown hair. That's 160 students. Do you see how I'm narrowing it down? I've just gotten rid of 1,000, almost 1,000 students, right? More than that, okay? And then let's take a look at our last characteristic. Dark athletic shoes, okay? That was our fourth characteristic. So I surveyed, and 7 of the 17 kids in my class had dark colored athletic shoes on. That's 41%. Okay, so now I'm going to add that into our probabilities. Notice that each time all I do is multiply them together. What are the odds of having all 4 of these characteristics? White shirt, jeans, light brown hair, and dark colored athletic shoes. Here's all my percentages by themselves. I multiply them together. It's 4%. The chances of somebody having these characteristics is 4%. That narrows it down to 64 students. That's still much better, right? I could probably start narrowing down through 64 students versus 1,600 students. So the idea is, with probabilities, you can multiply the odds together, and then you can figure out, okay, what's the possibility of that suspect having, like I gave you earlier, the blood type, the shoes, the blue fibers, and the hair color. If we multiply those odds of that person having those together, it's very, very, very low, and that is good evidence to have in court. So I always like to show you this as an example to kind of prove how class evidence can help you kind of narrow down a suspect pool, and you can show a jury, hey, this is valuable evidence, even though all these little characteristics by themselves aren't. The thought of having them all together is. All right, so let's do a little bit of practice with this. Can you identify this as individual or class? So the matches to the matchbook right here is the first one we're going to do. Could you individualize the matches back to the matchbook? And I would say yes. Because these have been ripped out, rip patterns are unique every time you rip something. Like if you try ripping a piece of paper 100 times, you'll never rip it exactly the same way every time. So if you can match the rip pattern back into this matchbox, I would say you've individualized the match back to the box. So what about number 2? It looks like a roll of duct tape and a piece has been cut using scissors off of it. So if I put 4 rolls of gray duct tape here, could you tell if this one came from this roll, or this roll? I would say no. This would be class evidence because it's been cut with scissors. If it had been ripped, I would say you could individualize it. But since it hasn't been ripped, I would say that this is class evidence because if I had 4 rolls here, there's no way I would be able to tell which roll that it came from. So it would be class evidence. It would be silver. It would be duct tape, but that's all I could tell you. For number 3, can you individualize this little tiny piece of paper back to the note? I would say yes, definitely. You can see how the rip pattern actually matches in every location. So I would say yes, you can individualize this piece of paper back to the note. For the skull, say I found this skull in the middle of the desert. Is this individual or class evidence? I would say this is class evidence. I could tell you whether the skull belonged to a male or female. I might be able to say if it's an adult or a child skull based on the size. I may even be able to get a general race from it, but without any other types of comparisons, there's no way I can do anything else with the skull. Now, I know a lot of you are thinking, well, you could do dental records or you could do DNA or different things like that. And you could, definitely. But then that's different evidence, right? Now you're looking at the teeth. If I would ask you about the teeth, you could say you could individualize the teeth if you had dental records, right? So you always want to make sure you stick to just the evidence that's being asked, because if you start to go, but what about this, what about this, what about this, then you're starting to take a look at other evidence, not the evidence at hand. And technically you could say I would find DNA and fingerprints on everything if I wanted. So I want you to make sure you always focus on just the evidence at hand. The last one right here is a shoe print. This would be class evidence, right? I could tell you the size of the shoe. I could tell you it's an athletic shoe, but I couldn't say, it's your right foot Nike shoe versus somebody else's, right? Because lots of those shoes had been made. So let's do a couple more examples so that hopefully you're ready to go for your lab. A pistol was found in a theater where a man was shot. The suspect known to have owned a Derringer like this one was apprehended. Would this gun be considered individual or class evidence? I would say I would say class evidence because we know it's a Derringer. We know it's got a brown handle. It's got silver cylinder. But that's all we have, right? We don't have anything else to compare it back to. If we had a bullet or a cartridge, we might be able to compare the bullet or cartridge back to the gun. But again, that's different evidence. So the gun itself would be considered class evidence. Number 2, a pair of latex gloves was found at the scene of a robbery. A box of the same brand of latex gloves was found at the suspect's home. Can you individualize the gloves back to the box? I would say no. You could say that they're white latex gloves. You could say they're a size large. It's possible that they came from this box, but there are lots of boxes that are just like this. There's no way I could prove it was this box versus another box, right? So I would say that's class evidence. Last one, a cigarette butt found at the scene of a crime. Is it individual evidence? I would say no. It's also class. You can determine the type of cigarette, probably, but that's about it. Again, don't say, well, we could pull DNA, because then the DNA itself was in a different type of evidence. If I said the DNA on a cigarette butt, then you could say individual if you had a match back. But the cigarette itself would be class. Okay. So hopefully this helps you figure that out. Some of